Howdy folks, and welcome to the Hillbilly Kitchen. Today we're making an onion hamburger skillet casserole that is likely to become your very favorite one-pot meal. Now this is a super simple one-pot meal. You need between 1 and 2 pounds of ground beef. You could also substitute ground turkey or something like that if you wanted to, ground chicken. And you need a whole bunch of thinly chopped onions. Now, almost shaved. You want 2 big ones or 2.5 to 3 if they're kind of more medium-sized ones. I've got 2.5 medium ones. And what gives this skillet meal all of its flavor is these thinly sliced onions. They're like you would get in French onion soup. And a lot of people call this a French onion hamburger casserole. And I suppose it kind of is. You don't have to cook your onions first or anything like that. You can cook the onions and the ground beef in together. They will saute just fine in with the ground beef, and the fat from the ground beef will cook the onions, and the onions will help season the ground beef. So there's no need to do this in 2 steps. Okay, now we can season this a little bit more, and how you season it is entirely up to you. I always use salt and pepper, of course. And I like a little Worcestershire sauce in this, but you don't have to. The salt will help bring out the flavor in the onions. So even if you normally don't do salt, you might want to do a little bit in it. And the pepper will also help bring out the flavor in the onions. The Worcestershire is entirely optional. I think it adds a lot of flavor to the whole dish. And I've never measured it. I'm probably using about a teaspoon, maybe a little bit more. You can do a little garlic powder or fresh garlic if you have it. It's up to you. I'm doing about ½ teaspoon of garlic. You can do hot peppers in this if you wanted to, but the idea of this meal is that it has the flavor of the onions. Now, there are so many onions in here that you really don't need to add any other vegetables to this. And when I make it, I usually do make it plain. I don't add any vegetables to it. I might serve a small garden salad with it or something like that. Dishes like this, I really kind of like them plain. But you have a lot of options for stuff that you can add into it. And I said you need 1 to 2 pounds of ground beef. Well, that kind of depends on your budget and on how many people you're feeding. Like with most hamburger meals, the more ground beef that's in them, the better they are. Okay, I'm going to let that sit there and cook a minute, and I'm going to talk about what else you need. The only other things you really need to make this dish are about a cup of shredded mozzarella cheese, which is about 4 ounces, a cup of long grain rice, or you can use 2 cups of minute rice. If you want to do minute rice in this dish, you can do minute rice. And you need 3 cups of water or broth. And you can, of course, add your bouillon cubes or your better than bouillon to give it the same flavor as broth. That's up to you which one you want to use. The plain water, though, will work, and you will have plenty of flavor without the bouillon or the broth. Okay, now, you can add in some peas and carrots. You could add in some broccoli or something like that if you wanted to add more vegetables to it, just to get a few more vegetables in your diet. I've got about a cup of peas here. I didn't measure them exactly. It's like half a bag of frozen peas. You could also add in canned peas if you want to. A lot of people like their skillet meals and their casseroles creamier, with more of a sauce in them. Well, you can add about a cup of sour cream. You could also add a can of creamed soup, like creamed onion soup, cream of mushroom soup, anything like that. Or you can add a little more water and add a packet of onion soup to it if you wanted to do that. And that would make it creamier. You can top it with some little chopped onions, you know, the little fried onions that look like this. And we've talked about topping casseroles with them before. This is a casserole, but you can make it entirely on top of the stove when it's hot. You don't have to turn the oven on and heat the house up. Or you can turn the oven on if it's cold in the wintertime and put it in there and let it brown up. and let that smell just fill the house. That's kind of up to you too. So there's lots of options, but the only thing you really need are the onions, the ground beef, the cheese, the rice, and the water. Everything else is optional. And add in your own flavor to it, and you can add more cheese, you can do no cheese, you know, just kind of do your own thing with it. Make it your meal. You want to cook this until your onions are all nice and translucent and your beef is good and brown. And if you want to, you can take some of the grease out of it. Again, it's entirely up to you. The grease adds a lot of calories and it adds a lot of flavor. It kind of depends on your diet and on how many people you're feeding. If you're feeding a whole bunch of people and you don't have a whole bunch of ground beef in there, hamburger, you might want to leave the grease, because the grease is what makes us feel full, the fat in food. So it will fill up a lot more people with a lot less hamburger. So that's kind of, you know, whether or not you take any grease out is entirely up to you. And if you use this little paper towel trick here, it will save you from spilling your dinner. And it also makes it easier to take out some of the grease and not take out all of the grease, because you want to leave a little of it in there. You don't want it drained completely dry. Now, after you take your grease out, you can stir it and cook it a little longer if you want to. Get your onions super brown, get your beef more brown, but you don't have to, because this is going to be cooking another 20 minutes once we get the rice in it. So that's just entirely up to you, how long you want to cook those onions, how long you want to stir it. But you can cook them until they're really, really brown. And cooking them until they start to brown, that does change the flavor and it will add more flavor. Normally, I would probably cook it a little bit longer than what I'm doing right now. But for time's sake, it is very done. And several of the onions have browned on the bottom of the skillet, so I'm going to get some of that flavor. And if you're in a hurry, that's done right there. So the next step, we're going to add our water or our broth, whichever one you're using, and we're going to bring that to a boil. Now, if you're adding water and you want to add a little bouillon or the better than bouillon to make the broth a little richer, this is where you would add it. Make sure you stir that in there, because you don't want to end up cooking it and it not being dissolved and having a big lump of broth in the center of your pan where all that flavor is concentrated in one big lump. You want to mix it throughout your skillet meal. Now, if you were adding the condensed soup, you would probably add it here. I don't usually use condensed soup when I'm cooking. If you're doing the sour cream, save it until after the rice is cooked, or even serve it on as a garnish on the table, because not everybody likes it. But if you want to make the whole dish creamier and your family likes it that way, you can add it after the rice is cooked, and I'll show you how to do that. Now, when our pot comes back to a boil here, if you're going to add peas or broccoli or whatever, add those now with your rice. And I'm not sure this skillet is going to hold it, but we'll try. And then stir that up, put your lid on it, turn the heat down on low, all the way on low, and let that rice simmer for 20 minutes. Don't take the lid off the whole time it's simmering. If you were going to bake this in the oven, you would probably want to use pre-cooked rice, or just go ahead and let your rice cook on top of the stove and then put it in the oven once it's cooked. At any rate, now we're going to turn it down on low and put the lid on and simmer it for 20 minutes. In 20 minutes, you can take the lid off. Your rice will be tender and everything is cooked at this point. Give it a little stir. I always like to stir it before I add my cheese. And then just dump your cheese on it and put the lid back on it and let it sit there until it melts. And that's all there is to making the basic dish. And you can see this does not have any peas in it. I told you I was going to show you a few options here. This has just the 3 cups of water in it. And it's not got a whole lot of sauce in it. And like I said, I know a lot of folks like their casseroles and their skillet meals to have a little more sauce, to be a little creamier. So if you want to add the sour cream in, add about a cup of sour cream. You can also add about a cup of cream. You could add a cup of yogurt or something if you wanted, or you could do the condensed soup either now or before the rice was cooked. Just about a cup, and you know, I didn't measure that. It's not exact because you don't have to add it. Now, because I added all that sour cream, I'm going to put this back on my low heat. Otherwise, my cheese will not melt. But you can see that cup of sour cream has made my dish much creamier. And as I get it mixed up here, it should be even creamier. You can also add in some cheese at this point and stir the cheese into the dish if you'd like to. But like I said, that's all optional. Even the cheese on the top is optional. If you add the sour cream, you are going to want to heat it, because a whole cup of sour cream will make the whole dish cold, and then when you call everybody in to serve it, everybody will complain because it's cold. Now, we're going to just dump our cheese on the top and let it melt, and then it is ready to serve. Now you can put this, like I said, in the oven under the broiler on low and brown it, or put it in the oven and on about 350 and bake it for maybe 15 minutes, and that will also brown it. But you do want to cut the heat off because it doesn't have enough moisture in it to continue to cook it, and just let the heat that's in the pan melt it if you don't want to put it in the oven. And that's kind of all there is to what I think just might become your favorite one-pot dinner. And after just about 5 minutes sitting there with the lid on, from the heat that's in the pan, the cheese is melted, and this is ready to serve. Before we go, I have a question for you. In Matthew chapter 16, Jesus was talking to his disciples, and they were discussing who the world said Jesus was, who the Pharisees thought he was, and who different people around the land thought that he was. And in Matthew 16:15, Jesus asked his disciples who he was. He said unto them, "But whom say ye I am?" That question not only determines where we spend eternity, but how we spend our lives. We can either spend our lives living in peace, hope, and love, or we can spend our lives in darkness and desperation. For me, Jesus is my Lord and Savior. And you notice I said he is, because he is, not he was. If you're struggling through life, ask yourself that question. Search the answer to that question. Seek him. I want to thank you so much for joining us again in the Hillbilly Kitchen. If you haven't already, please don't forget to click like and subscribe before you leave. Share our videos with your friends, and until next time, remember to put God first.